The dust of forward operating base Blackwood settled on everything with the fine, gritty impartiality of death. It coated the razor wire, the stacked sandbags, the corrugated metal roofs of the barracks, and the quiet woman who now stood in the doorway of the supply depot. Her name was Kaylin Vance, and her file said she was an administrative liaison, a paper pusher sent from a rear echelon command to help sort out the logistical nightmare of a forgotten outpost. The soldiers of Blackwood saw the file, saw her placid face and the way she moved without hurry, and drew their own conclusions. They concluded she was soft. They concluded she was nobody. This morning, for the third time in as many days, they had hidden her boots. She stood for a moment in her socks on the cool, packed earth of the depot floor, her gaze sweeping over the rows of shelving. She felt the casual malice behind the prank, the petty assertion of dominance in a place where boredom was a more persistent enemy than any insurgent. It was a test, a chipping away at the edges of a newcomer to see what they were made of. Her expression did not change. The soldiers thought they were hiding her shoes. They didn't understand that all they were doing was confirming for her, with every juvenile act, the exact tactical and psychological deficiencies of the unit she had been sent to observe. The crisis had not yet come, but it would. And when it did, they would find out what happened when you tried to trip a ghost. Kaylin Vance's arrival had been a non-event. A dust-caked transport had deposited her and a pallet of water bottles near the command tent and then rumbled away, leaving her standing in the swirling grit. Corporal Evans, a young soldier with eyes that still held a glimmer of life, had been tasked with showing her to her quarters. He'd pointed out the mess hall, the latrines, and the supply depot that would be her domain. "It's not much, ma'am," he'd said, calling her ma'am out of ingrained habit rather than any perceived authority. She had just nodded. Her bunk was a simple metal frame in a shared billet with a dozen empty ones. The base was understaffed, running on a skeleton crew that had grown complacent. The first morning, her boots were gone from under her cot. She'd found them in the shower block. The second morning, they were on the roof of the depot. She retrieved them without a word. Today, they were nowhere in sight. She didn't search. She padded in her socks to the logistics terminal, her movements silent and deliberate, and began her work. An hour later, Colonel Madsen requested her presence. His office was the only air-conditioned container on the base, a little box of manufactured comfort against the oppressive heat. He was a man shaped by regulation, his posture as rigid as the creases in his uniform. He held a thin file in his hands, Kaylin's file, and he looked at her with an expression of profound skepticism. "Vance?" he began, not inviting her to sit. "Your file is sparse." Kaylin stood before his desk, her hands loosely at her sides. "It's an accurate summary of my administrative background." Sir Madsen flipped a page. 14 years of service, all of it in logistics and records. Commendations for filing efficiency. Transferred from a data processing center in Germany. And now you're here, at a forward operating base. Why? The question hung in the chilled air. It was a challenge. He was asking what a clerk, a glorified librarian, was doing in his sandbox. "I was assigned here." Colonel, her voice was level, without inflection. "The orders stated that FOB Blackwood's supply chain management was in need of optimization," he scoffed. A quiet, dismissive sound. "Optimization. We need shooters, Vance, not paper pushers. We need eyes on the wire, not on a spreadsheet." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're taking up a slot. You're a liability. I've seen your type before. You come out here for the combat pay and the story, and you end up being a burden on the real soldiers who have to protect you." His dismissal was total. In his world of clear hierarchies and defined roles, she was an anomaly, a piece that didn't fit. She was a woman in a man's world, a clerk in a warrior's outpost. To him, she was less than nothing. She was a problem. Kaylin met his gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply absorbed his contempt like the desert absorbed the rain, letting it sink in and disappear without a trace. "I will do my best not to be a burden, sir," she said. Madsen waved a hand, a gesture of finality. "See that you don't. Stay in your depot. Do your inventory. Stay out of the way. Dismissed, Kalen turned and walked out of the chilled container, back into the searing, honest heat of the day. Madsen watched her go, shaking his head. He didn't see the way her eyes scanned the perimeter as she walked, or how her placid expression was the practiced mask of a hunter. He saw a clerk, and that was the first of his many mistakes. Kalen's days settled into a rhythm defined by heat and tedium. She worked with an unnerving, silent efficiency that began to feel less like clerical diligence and more like a form of active surveillance. The supply depot, a chaotic jumble of crates and containers when she arrived, was transformed. Within a week, every box was labeled, every shelf was inventoried, and every piece of equipment was logged in a system she designed herself, a system far more intuitive and robust than the standard military software. The soldiers who came to draw supplies found their requests fulfilled in seconds, not the usual 20 minutes of searching. They'd state what they needed, and she would walk directly to a specific container in the cavernous tent, and produce it without hesitation. Her memory was absolute. She knew where every box of MREs, every spare vehicle part, and every field dressing was located. But her focus was never just on the boxes. It was on the men who came to collect them. Kalen observed. She watched Sergeant Miller, a thick-necked bully who led the small clique of pranksters, and noted the way his eyes always darted to the exits. The sign of a man who was always thinking of escape, not engagement. She watched the patrol rotations and saw the patterns of complacency. The northern perimeter check was always 30 seconds shorter than the others. The game with her boots continued, a persistent, low-level harassment. One day they were in the mess hall's freezer, the next dangling from the comms antenna. She never reacted. Her lack of anger, of frustration, was more unnerving to her tormentors than any outburst would have been. She would simply locate them, her path always direct as if she knew exactly where to look, and retrieve them. She would then proceed with her day, her calm a silent rebuke to their childishness. Corporal Evans watched her more than anyone. He saw her walk across the gravel yard barefoot to fetch her boots from the flagpole where Miller's crew had hoisted them, her feet seemingly impervious to the sharp stones. He saw the utter lack of emotion on her face and felt a prickle of something he couldn't name. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was confusion. This wasn't the behavior of a victim. It was the behavior of someone who was operating on a different plane, playing a different game whose rules he didn't understand. One afternoon, he approached her as she was securing the depot for the evening. "Ma'am," he said, shifting his weight, "about your boots. It's Sergeant Miller and his guys. It's not right. You should report them to the colonel." Kalen finished fastening a latch and turned to face him. Her eyes, which usually seemed distant, focused on him with a startling intensity. "Discipline, Corporal," she said, her voice low and even, "is a matter of group cohesion. Reporting a symptom doesn't cure the disease. The disease is boredom and a lack of respect for the environment. That will correct itself." Evans didn't understand what she meant. "But they're harassing you." "They think they are," she corrected him gently. "What they're actually doing is providing data. Every action, no matter how small, is a piece of intelligence." She turned and walked toward her billet, her retrieved boots slung over her shoulder. Evans stared after her, the desert wind whipping sand around his ankles. He was beginning to realize that Colonel Madsen wasn't the only one who had misjudged the quiet clerk. Kalen Vance wasn't just counting boxes. She was counting everything. The sky began to change in the late afternoon of Kalen's 9th day at FOB Blackwood. The usual pale, washed-out blue of the horizon bruised to a sickly yellow-brown. The wind, once a steady, hot breath, began to gust and shriek, whipping sand into stinging projectiles. A shamal, a true desert sandstorm, was rolling in, a churning wall of dust and fury that would swallow the base whole. Alarms blared. Soldiers scrambled to secure equipment, their shouts swallowed by the rising roar of the wind. Within minutes, visibility dropped to near zero. The world shrank to a maelstrom of brown, a suffocating chaos that clawed at the eyes and lungs. FOB Blackwood was an island, cut off from the world. Kalen was in the supply depot when the storm hit, finalizing her inventory for the day. She didn't flinch as the metal walls of the structure began to groan and shudder under the assault of the wind. She simply saved her work, powered down the terminal, and stood for a moment in the shrieking darkness, listening. She heard the frantic, distorted shouts over the base-wide comms, the rising panic in the voices. Then she heard the one sound she had been expecting. A crackle, a burst of static, and then silence. The main communications array had gone down. Colonel Madsen's voice, tight with stress, came over the backup tactical radio, a system with a much shorter range. Tower 3 report. Sentry Post 2. Sound off. What's the status of the main comms? The replies were sporadic, broken by static. Can't see a thing, sir. Perimeter fence is shaking like it's gonna tear loose. Then, from a panicked voice she recognized as the young communications specialist. Sir, the main array is dead. I've lost the satellite uplink completely. Something must have shorted out in the storm. I can't fix it in this. The base was blind and deaf. They had no long-range communication, no way to call for support or receive intelligence. They couldn't even be sure their perimeter was secure. The storm provided perfect cover for an attack. Madsen's orders became sharper, tinged with a desperation he was trying to hide. He ordered double guards on the perimeter, but it was a useless gesture. No one could see more than 5 feet in front of their face. The men were on edge, their fear amplified by the sensory deprivation and the claustrophobic howl of the wind. In his command tent, Madsen stared at a dead screen, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. He felt a profound sense of helplessness. His training, his experience, all of it was useless against a dead wire and an act of God. His soldiers were huddled in their barracks or fighting to see through the brownout, their confidence eroding with every gust of wind. The FOB, which had felt so secure an hour ago, was now a fragile, isolated trap. The pressure was building, a palpable force pressing in on them just as hard as the wind. And through it all, Kaylin Vance remained in her depot, a single point of calm in the swirling vortex of chaos. She was listening. She was waiting. The moment of failure she had predicted had arrived right on schedule. The panic in the comms specialist's voice escalated. The backup generator for the relay tower just failed, sir. The voltage regulator must have been fried by a surge. I don't have a spare. The whole system is down. Madsen swore, his voice a raw bark of frustration over the tactical net. The entire command structure was collapsing into isolated pockets of scared soldiers. They were utterly alone. Kaylin zipped up the thin field jacket she kept for the cold desert nights. She pulled a pair of dust goggles over her eyes, cinching them tight. She still didn't have her boots. Miller and his crew, in a fit of pique before the storm hit, had locked them inside a footlocker in their own barracks. It didn't matter. She walked out of the supply depot and into the teeth of the gale. The wind hit her like a solid wall, tearing the breath from her lungs. Sand blasted against her exposed skin, 1,000 tiny needles. She leaned into it, her body angled, her feet finding purchase on the shifting ground. She was just a shadow in the brown chaos, moving with a purpose that seemed impossible in the disorienting fury of the storm. She didn't head for the command tent. She headed directly for the motor pool. The mechanics were struggling to lash a canvas cover over a stripped-down vehicle, their shouts lost in the wind. She ignored them, slipping into the maintenance bay. Her eyes, already adjusted to the dim light, scanned the shelves of spare parts. Her mind, a flawless catalog of the base's inventory, isolated what she needed. She bypassed the new, sealed boxes and went to a dusty corner filled with cannibalized equipment marked for scrap. She opened a control panel from a wrecked transport truck, her fingers moving with the certainty of a surgeon. She extracted a small, cylindrical component, a voltage regulator. It wasn't the exact model for the comms array, but its specifications were within a tolerable margin. It would work. She pocketed the piece and moved back out into the storm. Her path to the communications relay tower was not a straight line. She moved from cover to cover, using the corner of a building, a line of sandbags, a parked vehicle to break the force of the wind. It was a textbook example of tactical movement, executed barefoot in a hurricane of sand. The communication specialist was huddled inside the small shack at the base of the tower, frantically trying to get a response from the dead equipment. He looked up, startled, as Kaylin entered, her hair and clothes caked in dust. "Ma'am, you can't be out in this. The colonel ordered everyone to stay under cover." She didn't reply. She walked past him to the main power conduit. She unlatched the cover plate, revealing a tangle of wires and a scorched, blackened component. "The fried regulator." The specialist sputtered. "I told you, I don't have a spare. We'll have to wait out the storm." Kaylin produced the regulator she had salvaged. With deft, precise movements, she disconnected the melted wires from the old part, spliced them cleanly, and connected the new one. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds. She stepped back and nodded at the main console. "Try now." The specialist, looking dumbfounded, flipped a series of breakers. Lights flickered on the console. A low hum filled the shack. Then, the main monitor blinked to life, displaying a satellite connection diagnostic. Static crackled from the speaker, then resolved into the clear, calm voice of a remote command operator. "FOB Blackwood. This is Overwatch. We were showing you offline. Please confirm status." Over. The young soldier stared at the screen, then at Kaylin. She was already turning to leave. "Wait. How did you do that? Who are you?" She paused at the door, pulling her goggles back down. "I'm the administrative liaison," she said, and then she was gone, swallowed again by the storm. The story of the clerk who walked through the Shamel to fix the comms array spread through the base faster than the dust settled. The comms specialist, a private named Chun, told anyone who would listen. He described how she had appeared like an apparition out of the storm, how she had bypassed his own frantic efforts and fixed a fatal hardware issue with a scavenged part in under 2 minutes. "She didn't even hesitate," Chun said, his voice full of awe. "She knew exactly what was wrong, and she knew exactly where to find the piece to fix it. From a junk truck." "Who does that?" Corporal Evans heard the story and nodded to himself. It fit with the woman he had seen walking barefoot over gravel to retrieve her boots from a flagpole. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, and it was nothing like the one in her official file. In the command tent, Colonel Madsen listened to Chen's report with a stony expression. He had reestablished contact with Overwatch Command, averted a major crisis, and restored his control over the base. And he owed it all to the paper pusher he had dismissed as a liability. The cognitive dissonance was jarring. He pulled up Kaylin Vance's file again on his terminal, staring at the bland, uninformative text. Administrative background, records management, filing efficiency. It was a lie, a carefully constructed cover. He sent a priority request up the chain of command, attaching a report of the incident and demanding more information on Vance's service record. The reply he received an hour later only deepened the mystery. It was a single, curt line. "Operative's background is classified above your clearance level. Do not inquire further." Madsen leaned back in his chair, the gears in his mind grinding. He had an unknown asset on his base, an operator of unknown capabilities hiding behind a clerk's disguise. She wasn't a liability. She was a weapon. But whose? And why was she here? The shift in perception was most acute among Sergeant Miller and his crew. Their laughter about the boot prank had died in their throats. They had tried to humiliate a woman who, while they were cowering from the wind, had calmly walked into the heart of the storm and saved the entire base from going dark. Their petty bullying now seemed pathetic and profoundly stupid. They felt the eyes of the other soldiers on them in the mess hall. The whispers stopped when they approached. They were no longer the tough guys, the veteran jesters. They were the fools who had picked on a hero. Miller, a man whose authority was built on a fragile foundation of bluster, felt his power slipping away. The fear he inspired was being replaced by ridicule. He saw Kaylin walk into the mess hall to get a tray of food, her feet still bare. She moved through the room, and a space cleared around her. No one met her eyes. She was an object of myth now. The ghost, the storm walker. Miller watched her, his face a mask of resentment and a new, unfamiliar emotion. Fear. He and his men had poked a hornet's nest, but they were only just beginning to realize the hornet wasn't a hornet at all. It was a dragon. The tension on the base had changed. The casual, lazy contempt for the new clerk was gone, replaced by a mixture of awe, suspicion, and fear. Everyone was rethinking their assumptions about Kaylin Vance, and everyone was waiting to see what she would do next. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and the desert landscape scrubbed raw. The atmosphere on FOB Blackwood, however, remained charged. The incident had created a new, unspoken hierarchy. Kaylin Vance, the quiet clerk, now occupied a space at the very top, a position she had neither sought nor acknowledged. For Sergeant Miller, this was an intolerable state of affairs. His pride was wounded, his dominance challenged not by a rival soldier, but by a woman who sorted paperwork. His fear curdled into a reckless need to reassert himself. He decided the only way to reclaim his status was through direct confrontation, to prove she was just lucky, a fluke. He gathered the same 4 cronies who had been his accomplices in the boot pranks. They were hesitant now, the stories about her unnerving them, but Miller's personality was forceful. He bullied them into agreement. "She's one woman," he snarled. "We're just gonna talk to her. Get the boots back. We're gonna show everyone she's not some kind of spook." They found her that evening behind the mess hall, near the waste disposal units where the shadows were long and deep. She was on her way back to her billet, and they moved to block her path. Miller held up her boots, dangling them from his hand like a trophy. "Looking for these, Vance?" he asked, his voice a low sneer. The other 4 spread out, forming a loose semicircle, cutting off her retreat. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Kaylin stopped. She looked at the boots, then at Miller's face. She showed no fear, no anger. Her expression was one of mild weariness, like a teacher dealing with a child who repeatedly fails to learn a simple lesson. "They're government property, Sergeant," she said, her voice calm. "I need them to perform my duties. Please return them. You'll get them back when you show a little respect," Miller growled, taking a step forward. He was bigger than her, thicker through the chest and shoulders. He was counting on his physical presence to overwhelm her. "You think you're something special because you got lucky in a storm. You're just a clerk." Kaylin's posture subtly shifted. Her shoulders, which had been relaxed, squared slightly. Her weight settled low, balanced on the balls of her bare feet. It was a change so minute that only someone trained in combat would have recognized it for what it was. The transition from a passive to a ready stance. "This is your last chance to walk away, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but it had an edge of cold, hard finality. Miller laughed. It was a mistake. He lunged forward, reaching to grab her arm. He was fast for a big man, but to Kaylin he was moving in slow motion. She didn't retreat. She moved into him, a half step to her left that took her just inside the arc of his grasp. As his hand closed on empty air, she used her right hand to cup his elbow, her left to strike his wrist. It wasn't a punch. It was a sharp, precise rap on the radial nerve. His arm went numb, his fingers spasming open. The boots dropped to the ground. She continued the motion, using his own forward momentum to pivot him off balance. He stumbled past her, crashing heavily into a stack of empty water canisters. One down. The second soldier, seeing Miller fall, threw a wild punch. Kaylin deflected it effortlessly with her forearm, the blow glancing harmlessly off into the night. Her other hand shot out, not in a fist, but with fingers extended and rigid, striking him squarely in the solar plexus. The air left his lungs in a single, agonized gasp. He folded, dropping to his knees, unable to breathe. 2 down. A third tried to grab her from behind in a bear hug. Without looking, Kaylin dropped her weight, sinking below his hold. As his arms closed over her shoulders, she drove her head backward into his face. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. He screamed, staggering back, clutching a broken nose. 3 down. The last 2 froze, They had witnessed the systematic, brutally efficient disassembly of their 3 comrades in less than 5 seconds. They weren't facing a clerk. They weren't even facing a soldier. They were facing something else entirely. Kaelin took 1 step toward them. They flinched back as if she had swung a weapon. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by raw, primal fear. One of them actually whimpered. Kaelin stopped. She bent down, picked up her boots, and without a backward glance at the 5 men, 3 on the ground, 2 paralyzed by fear, she walked away into the darkness. Colonel Madsen was incandescent with fury. He had a report of a full-blown brawl on his desk. 5 of his non-commissioned officers, including a sergeant, had been incapacitated by a single, unarmed administrative liaison. It was a catastrophic breakdown of discipline. It was an embarrassment. He had Kaelin Vance standing at attention in his office. The door closed. The 5 soldiers were being treated at the infirmary for injuries ranging from a broken nose and severe nerve contusions to what the medic dryly described as acute respiratory distress. "I have 5 NCOs on sick call, Vance." Madsen bit out, his voice dangerously low. 5. And they all say you assaulted them. I want an explanation. And it better be the goddamn truth, because as of right now, I am 1 signature away from having you flown out of here in cuffs. Kaelin stood as still as a statue. She had put on her boots. "They cornered me, sir. They refused to return my property. They initiated physical contact. I defended myself." "You defended yourself?" Madsen slammed his hand on his desk. "Miller has a concussion. DeMarco has a broken nose. You put 3 men on the ground in seconds. What the hell kind of clerk are you?" He was shouting now, his composure shattered by the sheer absurdity of the situation. He was staring at the woman from the filing efficiency commendations, and all he could see was a lethal weapon that had just been discharged in the middle of his command. Before Kaelin could answer, a high-pitched, insistent buzz filled the room. It came from a secure telephone on Madsen's desk, a cream-colored device he had never once heard ring in his entire tour at FOB Blackwood. It was a direct line to CENTCOM High Command. He stared at it for a second, then snatched the receiver. Madsen, the voice on the other end, was quiet, calm, and radiated an authority that made the stars on Madsen's collar feel like cheap tin. "Colonel, this is General Harding. I'm calling about the asset we placed in your area of operations." "Designation?" "Vance?" Kaelin Madsen's blood ran cold. He straightened his spine, his eyes darting toward Kaelin, who remained impassive. "General." "Yes, sir. There's been an incident. I've seen the preliminary report." Harding's voice continued, devoid of emotion. "Let me be perfectly clear, Colonel. You are not to take any disciplinary action against that asset. The 5 soldiers involved are to be confined to barracks on charges of harassing a civilian specialist under military protection. Is that understood?" Madsen swallowed hard. "A civilian specialist?" "Sir, her file says what we wanted it to say, Colonel." Harding cut in, his voice taking on a razor edge. "Her real file is contained in a single folder in a vault in Langley that I, and most of the Joint Chiefs don't have the clearance to read. For the purposes of your command, you will refer to her as Nix." The name dropped into the silent room like a stone. Nix. Madsen had heard whispers of that call sign for years. A ghost, a legend from the darkest corners of special operations. An operative credited with dismantling terror cells, destabilizing rogue regimes, and executing missions so sensitive they were officially denied as ever having happened. Nix was a phantom, a rumor whispered in hushed tones by intelligence officers, and she was standing in his office. "The reason Nix is at your base," the general continued, his voice lowering again, "is that we have credible intelligence that a high-value target is using the smuggling routes near your perimeter. Her job is to observe, identify, and neutralize that target. Your job, Colonel, is to give her whatever she needs and stay the hell out of her way. She is not a liability. She is the only reason your forgotten little outpost has suddenly become one of the most important strategic locations on this continent. Do you understand me, Colonel Madsen?" Madsen's throat was dry. He looked at Kaelin, at her calm face and quiet posture, and for the first time he truly saw her. He saw the coiled stillness, the hyper-aware eyes, the economy of motion. He had been looking at a queen cobra, believing it was a garden snake. "Yes, General," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. Crystal clear, the line went dead. Madsen slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. The air in the small office was thick with a new, profound silence. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been inverted, shattered, and remade. He was no longer a commander reprimanding a subordinate. He was a functionary in the presence of a force he could not comprehend. News of the confrontation and its aftermath swept through FOB Blackwood like a firestorm. The official story was that 5 NCOs had been disciplined for harassing a civilian specialist. But the soldiers knew the truth. They had all heard the rumors, seen the injured men limping from the infirmary. The tale of how the quiet clerk had dismantled 5 aggressive soldiers in less than the time it took to draw a breath was already becoming legend. The name Kalen Vance was spoken with a new tone, one of hushed reverence and deep-seated fear. She was no longer underestimated. When she walked across the dusty compound, a path would clear for her. Soldiers would avert their gaze, suddenly finding their boots or the distant horizon intensely interesting. The casual swagger and loud talk that characterized the base's atmosphere evaporated in her presence, replaced by a tense, respectful quiet. The ones who had participated in the petty torments, even those who had just laughed along, felt a cold dread. They had been taunting a predator, entirely ignorant of the danger. Corporal Evans saw her walking toward the supply depot and, for the first time, felt he could look her in the eye. As she passed, he gave her a short, sharp nod. It was a simple gesture, but it was laden with meaning. An acknowledgement of her skill, an apology for his ignorance, a signal of unwavering respect. To his surprise, Kalen met his gaze and returned the nod, a flicker of understanding in her otherwise impassive eyes. The true moment of reckoning came that afternoon. Colonel Madsen was observing patrol deployments from the steps of his command post. He saw Kalen crossing the main yard, heading toward the perimeter fence. She was moving with her usual silent purpose, a ghost in the midday sun. All his training, all his ingrained sense of hierarchy, screamed at him to ignore her, to pretend the humiliating phone call with General Harding had never happened. But another instinct, a deeper and more honest one, took over. He straightened up, drawing himself to his full height. He planted his feet. As Kalen drew parallel to his position, he brought his hand up in a salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture he gave his junior officers. It was a crisp, formal, textbook salute, the kind a soldier gives to a figure of immense authority and respect. It was a public and unequivocal admission of his error. It was an apology. Kalen stopped. She was, as the general had said, a civilian specialist. She was not required to return the salute, but she turned her head and looked directly at him. For a long moment, their eyes locked. In that silent exchange, a new understanding was forged. She gave him a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement, then continued on her way. The salute and her acceptance of it was a treaty. He would stay out of her way and she would protect his base. When Kalen returned to her billet later that evening, she found her boots placed neatly at the foot of her cot. They were not just returned. They had been meticulously cleaned. The scuffed leather was polished to a mirror shine, the dust and grime scrubbed from the seams. A brand new pair of laces had been threaded through the eyelets with military precision. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was clear. It was an offering, a gesture of surrender and respect from the soldiers who now understood what and who they were dealing with. She had their attention. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the vast, empty desert in shades of orange and violet. Kalen Vance stood alone at the far edge of the base, by the northern perimeter fence she had noted was the weakest link in their security. The frenetic energy of FOB Blackwood was a distant hum behind her. Here, there was only the wind and the endless expanse of sand and sky. She was not gloating. She was not reflecting on her newfound status. The respect she had earned was merely a tool, a means to an end. It would eliminate distractions. It would allow her to work, Her true mission had not changed. She was a hunter, and her prey was out there, somewhere in that deepening twilight. The boots felt solid on her feet. They were just objects, leather and rubber, but they had become a symbol. Their absence had been a measure of the base's indiscipline, their return a measure of its fear, and their polished state a measure of its respect. She looked out at the darkening landscape, her eyes scanning the subtle contours of the dunes, the faint lines of ancient wadis, the heat signatures of nocturnal animals beginning to stir. Her senses were fully engaged, sifting through the data the desert offered, searching for the anomaly, the one discordant note that would betray the presence of her target. Colonel Madsen watched her from his office window, a pair of binoculars to his eyes. He didn't see a clerk or a specialist. He saw a guardian. He saw a sentinel standing watch on his walls, a silent protector whose capabilities he was only just beginning to appreciate. The soldiers in the guard towers gave her a wide berth, their own surveillance patterns carefully arcing away from the lone figure at the wire, as if by instinct they knew not to interfere. She was in her element now. The office politics, the petty harassments, the tests of dominance, they were all behind her. They had been obstacles quickly and efficiently cleared from her path. She had wanted to be invisible, a ghost in the machine, but their foolishness had forced her hand. Now she was something more powerful. She was a known entity, a legend whispered on the wind. As the last sliver of sun disappeared, casting the world into the soft grays of night, Kaylin pulled on a pair of gloves. Her work was about to begin. The soldiers of FOB Blackwood could sleep soundly, protected by the quiet woman they had once dismissed. They had hidden her shoes, and in response, she had revealed just enough of her true self to secure the base, not with fear, but with the unshakable certainty of her competence. Her dignity remained intact, not because she had won a fight, but because she had never allowed them to compromise it in the first place. She was Nyx, and the night was hers.